The acrid smell of burnt rubber and something metallic, like old pennies, filled the air. It was the first thing she registered. The second was the scream, a raw tearing sound that she vaguely recognized as her own. Anya's world was a universe of concrete and pain. The rough surface of a support pillar dug into her back while a supernova of agony exploded in her left forearm. It wasn't a clean pain, it was a shredding electric fire that seemed to sever her from the rest of her body. Her gaze drifted downwards. Blood, shockingly red under the buzzing yellow lights of the parking garage, soaked the sleeve of her scrubs, pooling on the grimy floor in a rapidly expanding halo. It looked like a macabre work of art. My arm, she thought, a strange, detached part of her brain taking notes. That's my arm. That's my blood. Then, a different sound cut through her daze. A high, keening wail. Not of pain, but of terror. Anya's head snapped up. A few feet away, pressed against the side of a dusty minivan, was the reason for the blood. A woman, her face a mask of chalky fear, one hand splayed protectively over the massive swell of her belly. Jessica. That was her name. A patient she'd discharged not 30 minutes ago, in for Braxton Hicks contractions. A false alarm. Jessica's eyes were locked on Anya, wide with a horror that was all-consuming. But she was safe. Unhurt. The baby was safe, and the thought cut through the pain with the force of a revelation. It worked. The squeal of tires from the garage exit ramp was the only evidence that he had ever been there. The shouting man with the desperate eyes and the flash of silver in his hand. The box cutter. He'd lunged for Jessica, screaming something about being replaced, about a ruined life. And Anya, without a single conscious thought, had moved. It wasn't a choice. It was an instinct, forged in the crucible of 1,000 ER shifts where the only thing that mattered was shielding the vulnerable from harm. She had pushed Jessica back and thrown up her arm, an offering, a shield. "Help!" Jessica finally shrieked, the word unlocking the frozen scene. "Somebody please help her!" Footsteps pounded on the concrete, the sounds echoing in the cavernous space. Hospital security. Colleagues. Anya tried to push herself up, to say something reassuring, but the world tilted violently. The yellow light swirled into a vortex, and the smell of old pennies gave way to darkness. Her last coherent thought wasn't of the pain or the fear, but of a quiet, smiling man on a distant sea. "David," she thought, "I'm sorry." Waking up was a slow, syrupy process. The world swam back into focus, not with the harsh yellow of the parking garage, but the soft, sterile white of a hospital room. Her own hospital. A dull, throbbing ache had replaced the fire in her arm, which was now encased in a bulky, white cast and elevated on a pillow. The clean, antiseptic smell of the ER she knew so well was now tinged with the cloying scent of anesthetic. Her colleague Maria, a veteran nurse with kind eyes and perpetually tired feet, was sitting by her bed. "Hey, hero," Maria said softly, her voice thick with emotion. "Gave us all a scare." "Jessica?" Anya's voice was a dry rasp. "The baby?" "Both fine, not a scratch on her. They're keeping her overnight for observation, but she's okay. You did that, Anya. You saved them." A wave of relief so profound it almost made her dizzy washed over Anya. It was worth it. Of course it was worth it. She was a nurse. This is what they did. They ran toward the danger. The next morning, however, the warmth of that relief began to cool, replaced by a strange and unnerving chill. It arrived not in the form of a doctor or a friend, but in a tailored navy suit and a pair of polished Oxfords that made no sound on the linoleum floor. He introduced himself as Mr. Carl Davies, the hospital's chief risk management officer. He had a smooth, placid face that seemed incapable of a genuine smile, though he offered a fleeting, plastic imitation of one. He didn't ask about her pain. He didn't commend her bravery. He sat in the visitor's chair, opened a slim leather portfolio, and got straight to the point. "Ms. Sharma," he began, his voice as sterile as the room, "we've reviewed the preliminary security report on yesterday's incident." He paused, letting the institutional "we" hang in the air. "What you did was certainly a choice." Anya stared at him, bewildered. A choice? However, Davies continued, his eyes scanning a document in his folder, as you know from your employee handbook, Section 4, Subsection B, hospital policy explicitly discourages staff from engaging in physical altercations on or off the clock while on hospital property for liability reasons. Liability. The word landed in the quiet room with the thud of a dead weight. I was protecting a patient, Anya stammered, the painkillers making her thoughts feel like they were moving through mud. A pregnant woman. A former patient who had been officially discharged, Davies corrected gently, in a public access area. The legal distinctions are subtle but important. It creates a very complicated liability picture for the institution. He looked up from his file, his eyes devoid of anything resembling empathy. There are multiple potential narratives here. We need to be careful to control the messaging for the good of the hospital. Therefore, I must strongly advise you not to speak with any outside parties. No media, no social media posts. All inquiries should be routed through our communications department. We're all on the same team here. He stood, snapping his portfolio shut. HR will be in touch regarding the next steps for your leave of absence. We hope you have a speedy recovery. He left without another word. Anya was left staring at the closed door, the throbbing in her arms suddenly more acute. He had taken her act of instinctual compassion and twisted it into a breach of contract, a liability issue, a narrative to be controlled. She wasn't a hero to be celebrated. She was a problem to be managed. The chill she'd felt earlier was beginning to seep into her bones. Later that afternoon, the chill intensified with the arrival of Detective Miller. He was a stark contrast to Davies' polished corporate armor. Miller looked like he'd been slept in his clothes, his face a roadmap of cynicism and exhaustion. He slouched into the chair Davies had occupied, pulled out a notepad, and sighed as if the universe had personally conspired to ruin his day. "All right, Ms. Sharma, let's go over this," he said, his tone suggesting he'd already made up his mind. "The woman you helped, Jessica Peterson, gave us a name. Kyle Collins. We're looking for him now. Walk me through it from your perspective." Anya recounted the events, her voice still weak. As she spoke, Miller's pen scratched against the paper, but his questions were sharp, pointed, and carried a subtle, grating edge of accusation. "So you initiated contact?" he asked, not looking up. "You yelled at him first?" "I told him to leave her alone. He was screaming at her. He'd shoved her." "Right, but you chose to intervene. Why didn't you just call security from a safe distance? Your cell phone was in your pocket, correct?" "There wasn't time," Anya said, frustration pricking at her. "He was going to hurt her." "Did you know either of them before this? Any history with Mr. Collins or Mrs. Peterson?" "No, I was her nurse, that's all." "And you have no idea why he would attack her?" "He was yelling something about her ruining his life, taking someone from him. It didn't make any sense." Miller grunted, a non-committal sound. "Okay, we'll look into it." He stood up, tucking his notepad away. He paused at the door, turning back to her. "A word of advice. Next time, be a good witness. Don't try to be a hero. It just makes more paperwork for everyone." He left. There was no word of thanks, no acknowledgement of her sacrifice. In the span of a few hours, she had been recast from savior to liability by her employer, and from victim to reckless vigilante by the police. The institutional walls that were supposed to protect people like her were instead revealing themselves to be cold, impersonal, and suspicious. The cast on her arm felt heavier than ever, a monument to an act that no one seemed to appreciate. Lying in the sterile white room, Anya felt a profound and terrifying sense of isolation begin to creep in, a loneliness that was far more painful than the wound itself. The world outside the hospital was no kinder. Her small second-floor apartment, once a sanctuary of calm, became a cage. Simple tasks were now Herculean labors. Opening a jar, tying her hair, even buttoning a shirt became frustrating. One-handed battles that often ended in tears of impotence. The pain in her arm was a constant, malevolent presence. A deep, grinding ache that medication only blunted, never erased. It throbbed in time with her anxieties, a physical manifestation of her life spiraling out of control. A week after her discharge, the first official salvo from the hospital arrived. It wasn't a get well card. It was a thick, cream-colored envelope bearing the hospital's logo. Inside, cold, formal language informed her that she was being placed on unpaid administrative leave, pending the full results of their internal review. Her medical insurance, tied to her employment, would expire in 30 days. But there was a solution, the letter explained. A generous one. Tucked inside was a settlement agreement. The hospital would cover the costs of her initial surgery, costs they had billed her for, she noted with a surge of bitter irony, and provide a one-time transitional payment of $15,000. In exchange, she would waive all future claims and, most importantly, sign a sweeping non-disclosure agreement that forbade her from ever discussing the incident, the hospital's response, or the terms of the agreement itself under penalty of severe financial repercussion. Anya stared at the pages, her good hand trembling. This wasn't a helping hand, it was a muzzle. $15,000. Her surgeon had already told her she'd need months, maybe even a year, of intensive physical therapy. She might never regain full dexterity in her hand. Her career as an ER nurse, a job that required two steady hands and nerves of steel, was in serious jeopardy. This pittance wouldn't even cover a fraction of her lost wages and future medical needs. It was a cheap, insulting attempt to buy her silence and scrub their hands of any responsibility. The message was clear. You are a mess we need to clean up. Here is a broom. Now disappear. Clinging to a desperate sliver of hope, she reached out to the one person she believed would stand with her. She arranged to meet Jessica, the woman she had saved, at a quiet coffee shop downtown. Anya imagined a tearful, grateful reunion, a promise to tell the world what had really happened. The reality was a cup of bitter coffee and a crushing betrayal. Jessica arrived with her husband, a tall man with a pinched, worried face who looked at Anya as if she were a ticking bomb. Jessica herself couldn't meet Anya's eyes. She fidgeted with her napkin, her gratitude from the hospital having evaporated, replaced by a palpable fear. Anya? I don't know how to thank you, she began, the words sounding rehearsed. You saved us. You really did. Of course, Anya said, a hopeful smile touching her lips. I just need you to tell the hospital that. And the police. Clearly. They're making it sound like I was reckless. Jessica's husband cleared his throat. That's the thing, he said, his voice low and firm. We've been advised not to get any more involved. Anya's smile faltered. Advised? By who? Their lawyer called us, Jessica whispered, finally looking up. Her eyes were pleading. The family of the man who did this, the Collinses, they're very wealthy, very litigious, the lawyer said. He told us that if we make this a public issue, if we get involved in any disputes, they'll find a way to drag us into it. They'll subpoena us, they'll disrupt our lives. With the baby coming... She trailed off, placing a hand on her stomach as if to emphasize the point. We told the police the basic facts, her husband added quickly. But we can't give public statements. We can't be your star witness in a fight with the hospital or this family. We're sorry. We just can't risk it. Anya sat, stunned into silence. The coffee in her cup had gone cold. She had taken a knife for this woman. She had bled for her. And in return, she was being offered a whispered apology and a hasty retreat. The fear of a wealthy family's legal threats had outweighed any sense of loyalty or moral obligation. It was a cold, pragmatic calculation, and Anya was on the losing side of the equation. She was no longer their savior. She was a complication they were desperate to avoid. The loneliness that had been creeping in now flooded her completely, leaving her feeling utterly, terrifyingly adrift. The final blow, the one that shattered her last vestiges of hope, was delivered by a courier a few days later. It was another thick, legal envelope, this one from a firm she didn't recognize, Vance and Associates. The paper inside was heavy, the letterhead embossed with a sharp, aggressive font. It was a lawsuit. But it wasn't from the hospital. It was from Kyle Collins, her attacker. Her mind refused to process it at first. The document, filled with dense, impenetrable legalese, claimed that she, Anya Sharma, had committed assault, battery, and inflicted severe emotional distress upon Mr. Collins. It painted a fantastical picture of the event, one in which a quiet, private conversation was violently interrupted by an unhinged hospital employee. It claimed Kyle had raised the box cutter only in self-defense after she had physically attacked him. It demanded $500,000 in damages for his trauma and sullied reputation. Enclosed with the suit was a letter from a senior partner, Thea Vance. Her signature was a series of sharp, jagged peaks like a dangerous mountain range. The letter was a masterpiece of veiled threats and condescending legalese, suggesting that a swift, private settlement in their favor would be in Anya's best interest. It was so ludicrous, so completely divorced from reality, that Anya almost laughed. But the laugh died in her throat, choked by a rising tide of panic. This was real. This was happening. The attacker, the violent, entitled man who had scarred her for life, was now officially, legally, the victim. And she was the perpetrator. The public crucifixion followed swiftly. That evening, a local news channel ran a segment on the parking garage incident. Anya watched, frozen, as a polished, confident woman with sharp eyes and an even sharper suit appeared on screen. The Chiron identified her, Thea Vance, attorney for Kyle Collins. "My client, Mr. Collins, is a troubled young man, yes, but he is the victim here," Vance said, her voice dripping with practiced sincerity. He was having a private, emotional conversation with an acquaintance when he was violently accosted by Ms. Sharma, a hospital employee who, we have learned, has a history of, let's call them, workplace intensity issues. My client acted in self-defense, terrified for his safety. They flashed Anya's hospital ID photo on the screen. A tired, unflattering picture taken at the end of a 12-hour shift. They mentioned she was unavailable for comment, making her sound guilty and evasive. They noted that the woman she allegedly saved had offered no public statement of support. Thea Vance had expertly woven a new narrative from the threads of the hospital's silence and Jessica's cowardice. She had turned Anya's heroism into aggression, her trauma into a fabrication. The story was a lie, a monstrous, grotesque lie. But it was televised. It was public. And in the court of public opinion, it was devastatingly effective. Anya's phone began to buzz incessantly with notifications. Friends, confused. Strangers, hateful. Social media had already appointed her judge, jury, and executioner. She was a thug, a liar, a violent psycho who got what she deserved. That night, Anya hit rock bottom. She sat on the floor of her darkened apartment, the hateful glow of her laptop screen illuminating the tears tracking down her face. Her world had been dismantled, piece by painful piece. Her body was broken. Her career was in ashes. Her reputation was destroyed. Her savings were bleeding away to cover rent and bills she couldn't pay. Every institution she had ever trusted, her employer, the law, the media, had not only failed her, but had actively participated in her destruction. She was alone, completely and utterly alone. Her eyes fell on the small, framed photo on her nightstand. A picture of her and David on a beach in San Diego, his arm wrapped around her, both of them laughing into the sun. David. Her David. A man whose quiet strength was the bedrock of her life. He was thousands of miles away, submerged in the silent, classified world of a naval mission in the South China Sea. He'd been in complete communications blackout for over a month, but his mission was scheduled to end this week. He was due to be reachable again. Today. With a hand that shook so badly she could barely control it, she picked up her phone. She ignored the hateful messages and opened her contacts, scrolling to a name that was simply listed as DSAT. It was a secure satellite phone number he'd given her for true emergencies. If this wasn't an emergency, nothing was. She pressed the call button. The phone connected, a series of strange clicks and a faint hiss of static filling the silence of her apartment. It rang once, twice. She held her breath, a single, desperate prayer forming in her heart. Please, David, pick up. The static broke, and a voice cut through the thousands of miles of ocean and silence between them. It was a voice she could recognize in the heart of a hurricane, a voice that was her true north. Calm, steady, unflappable. Anya? The sound of his name was a key, unlocking the dam of her composure. A raw, ragged sob broke from her lips. "David," she wept, the word a torrent of pain and relief. "Anya, what is it? What's wrong?" The calm in his voice was now laced with an urgent, focused concern. Through her tears, in a broken, stumbling narrative, she told him everything. The attack in the garage, the searing pain of the blade, the cold dismissal of the hospital administrator, the cynical detective, the insulting settlement offer, the betrayal of the woman she saved, the vicious lawsuit, the televised lies of Thea Vance. She poured out the entire nightmare, every last ounce of her fear, her humiliation, and her despair. On the other end of the line, David was silent. It wasn't an empty silence, it was a weighted one. He was listening, absorbing, processing. He didn't interrupt with platitudes or outrage. He let her speak until she had nothing left to say, until her sobs quieted into exhausted, shuddering breaths. When he finally spoke, his voice was dangerously, preternaturally calm. It was a tone she had heard only once before, when a junior officer had made a critical mistake during a training exercise that could have cost lives. It was the calm of a gathering storm. "Okay," he said, the single word carrying the weight of a fleet. "I've got it. I'm coming home." "David, you can't. Your mission—" "My mission is over," he stated, a note of finality in his voice that brooked no argument. "I'm flying out of Subic Bay in the morning. I'll be there in 2 days. Anya, listen to me very carefully. Don't sign anything. Don't talk to anyone. Don't respond to any emails or letters. Do you understand?" "Yeah," she whispered. "Good. Now I need some information. What is the name of the risk management officer?" "Davies. Carl Davies." "The detective?" "Miller. I don't know his first name." "And the lawyer?" "Vance. Thea Vance." He repeated the names back to her, his voice low and precise, as if he were logging enemy targets into a fire control system. "Davies, Miller, Vance, okay." He paused, and for a moment, she could almost feel his presence, a shield forming around her from halfway across the world. "I love you," he said, and the simple words were a vow, a promise of retribution. They have made a grave mistake. 2 days later, the doorbell rang. Anya, her heart pounding, opened it to find him standing there. Admiral David Clark, in a simple gray polo shirt and dark jeans, looked more like a college professor than a 3-star flag officer. But the quiet, unshakable authority in his bearing was more potent than any uniform. He didn't say a word. He just stepped inside, gently pulled her into his arms, his embrace a fortress of warmth and safety. He was careful with her injured arm, but his eyes tracked down to the cast, and for a fleeting second, a flicker of something arctic and dangerous passed through his gaze before being replaced by pure, unadulterated love. He walked into her small living room, his eyes taking in the scene of her despair, the pile of ominous letters on the coffee table, the laptop still open to a page of hateful comments. He didn't comment on the mess. He simply picked up the lawsuit from Thea Vance, the settlement offer from the hospital, and a sheaf of overdue medical bills. He read them, his expression unreadable but his focus absolute. Then he sat at her small kitchen table, pulled a sleek, military-grade laptop from his bag, and began to type. His fingers moved across the keyboard with a quiet, efficient speed. "What are you doing?" Anya asked, her voice barely a whisper. David looked up at her, his blue eyes clear and steady. "Reconnaissance," he said simply. "Every organization, every person has a structure, a hierarchy, a set of dependencies. They have pressure points. We just need to find them and apply precise, controlled force. This isn't a street fight, Anya. This is a campaign." The next morning, David made his first move. He wasn't dialing senators or calling in military favors. He was fighting on their turf, but with a superior arsenal. He took Anya to a gleaming skyscraper in the city's financial district, to an office so high up it seemed to be floating in the clouds. The name on the door was Vance, Covington, and Stowe. They were met by Arthur Vance, no relation to Thea, a legal lion in his late 60s with a mane of white hair and a reputation for dismantling corrupt corporations and arrogant bullies for breakfast. Arthur listened patiently as Anya, encouraged by David's steady presence, recounted her story. When she was done, Arthur leaned back in his chair, a skeptical look on his face. It's a nasty situation, Ms. Sharma. A classic he said, she said, but with a corporate cover-up and a well-funded smear campaign. Difficult, expensive. Then David spoke. He slid a thin file across the vast mahogany desk. This isn't he said, she said, David said, his voice calm and level. This is fact versus fiction. In this file, you'll find a full profile on Thea Vance. It details a pattern of behavior across her last 5 major cases. Witness intimidation through legal threats, strategic media leaks to friendly journalists, and the filing of frivolous counterclaims to exhaust the resources of her opposition. You'll also find preliminary background on the Collins family, including 2 prior assault allegations against their son that were settled out of court. All of this was gathered legally in the last 24 hours. Arthur Vance picked up the file. As he read, his eyebrows climbed higher and higher. He looked from the file to David, a new respect dawning in his eyes. My wife's name will be cleared, David continued, his voice leaving no room for negotiation. Her heroism will be publicly recognized. The hospital will be held accountable for its negligence and abandonment. The lawsuit against her will be dismissed with prejudice, and Ms. Thea Vance will face professional consequences for her unethical conduct. Your firm has the reputation for this kind of work. I will provide the resources and the intelligence. You will provide the legal firepower. David slid a black, featureless credit card across the desk. Whatever retainer you require, money is not the object. A just result is. Arthur Vance looked at the card, then at David's unwavering gaze, and finally at Anya's tired but resolute face. A slow, predatory smile spread across his lips. Admiral, he said, having clearly done his own quick reconnaissance, I believe this is going to be a very productive partnership. The tide had begun to turn. David's campaign was a masterpiece of quiet, relentless pressure. He didn't storm into offices and make threats. He dismantled his wife's enemies with the precision of a surgeon, using their own systems and weaknesses against them. The first domino to fall was Mr. Carl Davies. Davies was summoned to an emergency board meeting on a Tuesday morning. He walked into the hospital's opulent boardroom expecting to discuss damage control for the bad press. Instead, he found 2 of the most powerful members of the board of directors looking at him with expressions of cold fury. And sitting quietly at the far end of the long table, in a simple blazer and slacks, was David Clark. He introduced himself simply as, I'm Anya Sharma's husband. David didn't speak for several minutes. He let the board members grill Davies about the handling of Anya's case, about the insulting settlement offer, about the PR nightmare now engulfing them. Davies sweated under the lights, spouting his usual corporate jargon about mitigating risk and unfortunate outcomes. Then David slid a file, identical to the one he'd given Arthur Vance, to the head of the board. The issue here is not a single unfortunate outcome, David said, his voice cutting through Davies' blustering. It's a pattern of behavior. Mr. Davies has a documented history of prioritizing liability mitigation over patient and employee safety. At his previous post at Northwood Regional, his policies led to the hospital quietly settling 2 wrongful death suits related to understaffing in the ICU. Before that, at a hospital in Ohio, he buried an internal report about a faulty piece of surgical equipment which later malfunctioned and permanently injured a patient. His actions against my wife were not an anomaly. They are his standard operating procedure. The information, David explained, came from a former Navy intelligence analyst who now ran one of the country's top corporate security firms. It was all verified, all sourced. This procedure, David concluded, his eyes locking onto Davies, if made public in the context of what was done to a decorated hero nurse who saved 2 lives on your property, would do irreparable damage to this hospital's reputation, its donor confidence, and its patient trust. The choice, of course, is yours. Davies' face had gone from flushed to ashen. He had been so focused on managing the hospital's liability that he never thought to manage his own. He was escorted from the room by security. By the end of the day, his employment was terminated, and the board announced a full, independent audit of the hospital's risk management and employee relations policies. Next was Detective Miller. David didn't go over his head, at least not at first. He requested a meeting and went to the precinct, where he found Miller in the same tired suit, looking just as annoyed as he had in the hospital room. This time, Miller's captain was present, a fact David had quietly arranged through a single, polite phone call to the deputy commissioner, an old acquaintance from a joint agency task force. "Detective," David began, his tone respectful but firm. "I'm here to provide new information relevant to the assault on my wife, Anya Sharma." He laid another file on the table. It contained the PI's report on Kyle Collins, the prior assault allegations, the payoffs. It also included a sworn affidavit from a drug dealer who, after a conversation with David's investigator, suddenly felt the need to unburden his conscience. The affidavit stated that Kyle Collins was high on a cocktail of cocaine and benzodiazepines and was in debt to the dealer. The dealer had been seeing Kyle's ex-girlfriend, who was a distant cousin of Jessica's husband. Kyle's rambling threats in the garage weren't about Jessica at all. They were a paranoid, drug-fueled tirade directed at the wrong person. Finally, the file contained crisp, time-stamped security footage from a gas station a mile from the hospital, taken 20 minutes before the attack. It showed Kyle Collins acting erratically, shouting at the pump, clearly intoxicated. "My wife, an exemplary citizen and a medical professional, was grievously injured while saving 2 lives," David said, looking not at Miller but at his captain. "She was then treated with suspicion while the man who attacked her, a man with a documented history of violence and substance abuse, was allowed to remain free and file a harassing lawsuit against her. I trust that with this new evidence, Detective Miller will finally be able to conduct the thorough and unbiased investigation this case has deserved from the start." The captain's face was grim. He looked at the file, then at Miller, a silent, furious promise of intense departmental scrutiny passing between them. Miller, pale and humbled, could only nod. "Yes, sir. I'll get right on it." Justice, long delayed, was finally being set in motion. The final act was the takedown of Thea Vance. It took place in the sterile, soulless environment of a deposition room. Thea had insisted on deposing Anya, hoping to break her on the stand. She strutted in, confident and predatory, ready for the kill. But the Anya who sat across from her was not the broken, weeping woman from the apartment. Coached by Arthur Vance and with David sitting silently, observing from the back of the room like a hawk, Anya was a pillar of calm dignity. She answered every one of Thea's loaded, aggressive questions with simple, unshakable truth. Thea's tactics, so effective on television, fell flat against the quiet power of Anya's sincerity. Then it was Arthur Vance's turn. He didn't depose Anya, he called Kyle Collins to the stand. What followed was a legal vivisection. Arthur, armed with David's intelligence, systematically dismantled Kyle's story. He brought up the drug use, the past assaults, the gas station footage. Piedbine, deprived of his lawyer's coaching, fell apart. He contradicted himself, grew belligerent, and ultimately dissolved into a pathetic, whimpering mess, all under the watchful eye of a court stenographer. Arthur saved his masterstroke for last. He turned to Thea Vance. "Ms. Vance," he said, his voice booming in the quiet room, "given that your client has now perjured himself multiple times, and given the evidence of his condition prior to the incident, are you prepared to withdraw this frivolous and malicious lawsuit?" Thea began to bluster, but Arthur cut her off. He placed a new document on the table. "Because if you are not, here is a copy of the motion for sanctions we are filing against you and your firm for the filing of a bad faith claim, and beside it, a formal complaint to the State Bar Association regarding your attempts to intimidate a witness, Mrs. Jessica Peterson, into silence. We have her sworn statement." Thea Vance stared at the documents, her mask of professional invincibility finally cracking. She had been outmaneuvered, out-resourced, and out-thought at every turn. Her career was now on the line. She looked at David in the back of the room, who simply met her gaze, his expression unchanging. She had brought a knife to a gunfight, and she had just realized her opponent commanded a battleship. She turned to the stenographer, her voice tight with fury and defeat. "This deposition is over. We will be in touch." She all but ran from the room. The public vindication was swift and total. David hadn't just relied on the law, he understood the power of narrative. He gave the entire story: the hospital's cover-up, the police's initial incompetence, the full background on Collins, and Thea Vance's tactics to a highly respected national investigative journalist. The resulting television special was devastating. It opened with the chilling 911 call from Jessica, her terrified voice screaming, "A man named Kyle Collins just stabbed a nurse who was protecting me." It showed the gas station footage. It featured an interview with a now unemployed Mr. Davies, offering a weak, sniveling apology. It culminated in an interview with Anya herself. She was no longer the haggard victim. She was poised, her arm in a less bulky brace, her eyes clear and strong. She spoke not of anger, but of principle. She spoke of her duty as a nurse. She spoke of the importance of doing the right thing, especially when it is the hardest thing to do. The segment, titled "The Nurse Who Wouldn't Back Down," went viral. The public outcry was a tidal wave. Stand with Anya trended for days. A month later, Anya sat in the quiet of her living room, a cup of tea warming her good hand. The storm had passed. The Collins family, facing public ruin and now aggressive criminal charges against their son, had dropped the lawsuit and disappeared from public life. Thea Vance was fighting to save her license. City General Hospital, under new leadership, had issued a formal, front-page public apology and offered Anya a settlement so large it was transformative. It included full coverage of all past and future medical costs, years of back pay, and a significant sum for damages. More importantly, they had instituted the Anya Sharma Heroes Policy, a new protocol protecting and rewarding employees who intervened in emergencies. In the pile of mail was a long, handwritten letter from Jessica filled with apologies and regret. Anya read it, then quietly filed it away. She had accepted the hospital's settlement but had respectfully declined their offer to return to the ER. The physical therapy was grueling, but she was slowly regaining strength in her arm. With the money, she had enrolled in a top-tier university to become a nurse practitioner, specializing in trauma counseling. She would still heal people, but now it would be on her own terms. David, home for another week before his next deployment, watched her as she studied a complex medical diagram. He picked up a small framed chart from her desk. It wasn't a photo, but a detailed map of a constellation. "What's this?" he asked softly. Anya looked up, a gentle smile on her face. "It's a star chart for the celestial quadrant over the South China Sea. I looked it up while you were gone," she said. "I wanted to see what you were seeing. I wanted to look at the same stars." He looked from the chart to her face, a wave of emotion washing over him. He had waged a brilliant tactical war on her behalf. But he realized she had been fighting her own battle all along, a quieter, lonelier one. She hadn't just been waiting for rescue. She had been navigating by her own light, holding on to her integrity in the dark. "Anya," he said, his voice thick with a love and admiration that ran deeper than any ocean. "Thank you for everything." She reached out and took his hand. "I just told the truth," she said. "You were the one who made them listen." He shook his head, his thumb stroking the back of her hand, tracing the faint lines of her own quiet strength. "No," he said. "You were the one who was strong enough to live it." Together, they looked out the window at the setting sun. Two halves of a whole, a team forged in crisis and bound by a love as vast and as constant as the stars themselves. The scars remained, but they were no longer symbols of a wound. They were a map of survival and the starting point of a new journey.